No, that's great. Brilliant. Well, we're going to move on to the next area now. So looking at the conditions and application. Thank you very much to Alan Daru and John Sissons, who are both curious to know about the right temperature for phenoxys. Jim, I'm going to open this up a bit broader than just the temperatures. I mean, how important are field conditions at the time of application, Jim?
Well, I think it's really crop conditions at and after application that are important, not just that application itself. But you have to think really about what the phenoxys are and what conditions they need to maximise their potential. Now, MCPA was first synthesised in 1941 at Gillett's Hill. And it was as a result of research on plant hormones, and the auxins are plant hormones and the phenoxys are synthetic auxins. So we're talking about hormones here. In fact, the herbicide are synthetic hormones that disrupts the growth of the plant. Now, when you think about hormones, there's 2 or 3 things you've got to bear in mind. One is plant hormones. One is that they are water soluble. Now, this brings advantages and it brings disadvantages. The advantage is it can whip up the plant in the xylem and get to the meristem, which is where its site of action is, very quickly indeed. But it does need warm conditions to disrupt the growth. You need growth to disrupt. So they actually get to the site of action very quickly, and if it's warm, they will disrupt growth. But the problem with being water-soluble herbicides is that when you spray them on the outside of the plant, they've got to get through the cuticle. And the cuticle's anti-water, for want of a best word. So you really got to play the cuticle game, a bit like glyphosate as well. So you need a cuticle that is as thin as possible, and if possible, with water pathways through it, which is possible to get. So you then have to think, what are the best conditions to have a thin cuticle and a water-bearing cuticle, if I want a better word. And you need warmish soils, moist soils, and warm nights and high humidity. They're the perfect conditions. On occasions, you can get the perfect conditions, but not every time, by any means. So you do need that combination at and after spraying of getting through the cuticle, having a thin cuticle, and having these conditions: warmish moist soil, warm nights, and high humidity. Now, in trials in the 1980s, some of which I did, you could get actually exceptional levels of cleavers from Mecaprop. But the conditions was that the soil temperature at 10 centimetres at 9 o'clock in the morning should be 8 degrees C. And you had the other conditions as well of moisture, soil moisture, and warm nights. Now, for the other weeds, we found that to get the best out of the hormones, you probably need a soil temperature of 6 degrees C at 9 o'clock in the morning. And then the moister soil, within reason, and the moisture of the atmosphere and the warm nights help this. Now, if you've got, think that all those conditions, that's where mixtures with other herbicides came in. So that is one measurement you can do, for want of a better word. It's a bit mechanistic, but the other thing you could do, of course, is get the plant to tell you when the cuticle is thin. And nearly all the activity of the hormones are from the hormones applied to the 2 youngest fully expanded leaves of the target. Over 90% of the activity comes from those 2 leaves, the youngest leaves. And therefore, they're the leaves to look at, not the rest of the plant that might look hoary and worn through the winter, but those 2 young leaves, and also probably the successive leaves. And obviously, if they're growing rapidly, there'll be a lighter green usually, and they will just look a fresher leaf, basically. So look at the crop and look at those 2 youngest leaves, because that's where the site of action is, or the site of application is. So you can either use this mechanistic 6 degrees temperature for most weeds, or 8 degrees for cleavers. And if you're failing to get that, you know, you can add something else to the hormones for some weeds, and it's not necessarily for all weeds. Or you can just look at the plant and take an informed judgment, and the plant will tell you that. Another thing you can look at, if you've got cleavers, is if the internodal gap of the cleavers, if the gap between each of the rosette type leaves is increasing. It shows then that the growth is increasing, and increasing rapidly. So they're the main issues.
Great.
I just before boring you to death, I would just say something about phenoxes and the formulations, because phenoxes are using very simple formulations, but they all have sequestering agents, because calcium can actually form complexes with the active ingredients and render them less active. So there's always been a bit of concern about hard water and phenoxes in terms of activity. But the French have investigated this thoroughly, very thoroughly indeed, but only in pot trials. And they found, if anything, the phenoxes were reducing the activity with exceptionally hard water. And I'm talking about exceptionally hard water, probably harder than you get in our tap water. But the actually hard water affected the activity of the phenoxes less than it does glyphosate. Glyphosate was the most affected. So another water-soluble herbicide. So I don't think we should worry about hard water, but I know John's had a bit of a thing about hard water in the past, and I don't think you could comment on that.
Well, we've got we're moving to tank mixes and sequences and so on later, so perhaps that would be the opportunity to talk about it. But I don't know whether you know, before we move off the conditions and application, have you got anything to add to that, John or Dan? No.
No, not from this one.
Dan, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've picked up a little bit on that in the next section, so we can discuss further. Brilliant.
Well, let's move on then to growth stages and timings. Well, thank you very much to Julia Kovalova, I hope I've pronounced your name there correctly, and Joanna Clayton, both wanting to know about